There's a root level at which I do not understand the sandbaggers. I've seen enough of the machinery to put together a sophistry that they must be playing. Hillary Clinton is a lawyer for Leslie Katz and Gail Burstyn and Peter Gabriel and David Bowie's machine. In other words, the Reagan administration. Played a sleight of hand and fancy footwork and shell game with the letters of Gail Burstyn saying, look what we found. And we're unable to disclose that Crary was crying over a girl's virginity when he could have saved John Lennon. And this became a dungeon master sequence in media affairs. And you know how people fight for attention. It makes sense from the point of view of like race feuding. You know, if one race has a tragedy, they want to see the other race have a tragedy, even if it's not related, because they're conditioned by that mindset. And with the arc, it's easy for people who hear the story and support Obama to say, well, what of it? If you were tricked into an affair with an Indian woman, why shouldn't the black man call dibs on Midori? It sounds like a perfectly good fight club arrangement. And it's a way of keeping the victims entertained. So all of that is clear. That's what sandbagger is. It works this smoke and mirrors miracle. And of course, when I got under the hood, I showed that Paul McCartney's claims that he was just his sleeves were wet with tears over the loss of John Lennon. The boring idea of Jimmy Crary was just too much, and Roger Waters already hated schools. What does he need a father like mine driving a school bus about? And they made movies like Kids, which glorify Epstein Island scenarios. And said that's what's cool. Absolute beginners. Call them beginner scenarios. I mean, so you do get the picture of what the sandbaggers are and sandbagger law. But you don't quite put your finger on how it could have happened. Now, I found what might be an important clue. There was a poet in the book, The Harlem Renaissance Reader. His name is Gene Toomer. And he was in the 1920s in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, an advocate for George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. And that's a very interesting factor about him, is that he began to say he wasn't an African American, he was just a human being, and that human beings should see beyond race. George Gurdjieff, to me, for all the merits that that may have, that idea of being able to see past race barriers as an instinct of change may have some merits. But Gurdjieff was someone who I was standoffish about because he survived Vichy France as a conspicuous clandestine operator, and that sounded like collaborator to me. I've had all kinds of problems with the Peter Gabriel movement who were checking out Gurdjieff. Robert Frederick King Crimson went away to one of their spas for reconditioning after touring with his miserable circus rave. So I don't understand. I don't understand how a person can see what I'm saying in the negligence that's fundamentally a factor in the sandbagger squads. The idea that you can just transfer the race and make a Dungeons and Dragons media show out of tragedies that are totally unrelated. They don't, they have symbolic suggestiveness. Is a hidden feature of the image machine of the celebrity superstate in building the arc of the crime I discuss. That doesn't explain why intelligent people would be conditioned to promote such fabrications as an authorized collective response to letting the attackers go free to do as they please and strike again, giving them total impunity. As Seattle put it, building momentum for them so they could then attack Gaza. As though this was praiseworthy. And Sandbagger Law is a place where they did that and yet promote world solidarity in protest of what's happening in Gaza. So it is a little bit arcane. It's like an oracle or a Swami group that the Beatles put together. So somewhere in the imaginary Alamo, somewhere in the fire and smoke of the imaginary Alamo, of the supernova, of Aaron Bushnell, of the rave maskers, of the Star Sandwich, somewhere in the fire and smoke, John Lennon Houdini, using the fifth dimensional psychology of this Gurdjieff scene through Hollywood and international media. Russia was building its cinema programs with the help of Sergei Eisenstein, who was a fan and friend of Walt Disney back in those days. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Sidney Poitier used to get gruffy when asked questions about the civil rights movement or about his black condition. Because he said, why don't you ask me my opinion about opera? I met a character like that who said that something to the effect that I was a stooge for my own racism by pursuing these kinds of questions. And of course, he was in the pocket of the Israeli lobby the way Lloyd Austin is. So I don't understand the situation. I don't mean to play all big. I know some details that are not being acknowledged about this Gurdjieff magic show and its deep phenomenon of theological compulsion. So I get the idea of why they would use me and bait me and batter me as a child to rack up a physicality dossier, like it's a and then innuendo it with I left the girl a virgin, therefore how do we know he's not a rapist? So they castrate me and demand all of my details of information about people who never complained about me. Because Sean Lennon wants the information or something. Of course, that's the essence of the Sandbagger cult, which involves people like Christopher Hitchens, I don't know if anybody's broken from them. Christopher Hedges, George Galloway. I don't know if any of the people in alternative media are broken from. Randy Kay, that kind of them. I don't know if any of them are broken from. And, and I don't understand. I understand the people who are good students of counterculture from whom the situation has factually been withheld from them would look at me and say, oh, there's that squish. He could have saved John Lennon and Paul McCartney hates him. And we'll feel better if we rub him out. And the Sandbagger lobby adopted that program with Amanda Harcourt and Yoko Ono, which they called a feminazi solution. While granting impunity to Israel and ignoring my warnings about what it really meant. They don't acknowledge the truth of what happened because they have it set up. And I understand that that setup, that death row over two virgins, is accepted and institutionalized by British Labour, by the royal family, by the Pink Floyd people, by the Greta Thunberg people, by Nation magazine, the New Republic, UW administration, Seattle Green Party are really active when it comes to cruelly mistreating my identity. It's disturbing. I understand that that's established fact. The death row set up around two virgins of the Sandbagger lobby. But there are some things I don't understand about the Sandbagger movement itself. The cloud like ethereal beatitude that Sandbagger law has for them when they have no choice but to admit that their negligence gave the opening to Israel to go into Gaza this way, that all the evidence impugns them of making a terrible mistake. And I wonder on the deep subconscious level how much of it is a belief that they're more conscious now. I don't like to tamper with um, people's spiritual matters. That's not why the, initiated an investigation from the medical community in 1984 for it. I wanted to save lives. It wasn't really possible for me to understand the great deflection that was being put up by people who didn't care, like Amanda Harcourt and Peter Gabriel. I can understand people saying we prefer their music and their energy and their power to mine. But it doesn't make any real clarity come into this cloud of beatitude from which people are both to blame for what happened in Gaza and recriminating with Israel over it, which is, of course, proper and due. It seems to be that at the United Nations, it's understood that Zionism is an apartheid racist phenomenon. And the Jewish people are not inherently Zionists. That's perfectly obvious. So Yoko Ono took what they feel comfortable calling a feminazi position about me and saying it's not a Zionist strategy, which it obviously is. Two Virgins War Game was obviously a Zionist strategy. It was in the script of this girl who was never investigated or arrested. And saying it's just protection of a Jewish girl who was being hassled by an ex-boyfriend. And that's where they get the Sandbagger movement, sitting their beatitude in Sandbagger law. But on the deeper level of how they explain that to themselves, I mean, I know they have this bypass about could have saved John Lennon, but on the deeper level of how they explain to themselves what went wrong in the social conditioning of the movement, that they would gladly work hand in hand with the people responsible, actually responsible for Lennon's murder if he died, which he didn't. But the people actively responsible for the crime that took place, because the fact that had nothing to do with it makes them angrier because of their split sense of personal responsibility in the matter. They're happy to play a game even when they know it's not a game. That hurts innocent people, even when they know they're not addressing the problem of actual crime and guilty persons. And I just wonder how it happened. How do these excellent students whose facts base is superb, whose instinct for social honesty is very challenging and worthy, even when in need of fact checking or review, how do such people stand being in the vapors of Shambhala? I don't think it's just a succulent rapture interrogating Jimmy Crary. I think it goes to the root of these consciousness routines that come out of like Gurdjieff, the smoke and mirrors of Gurdjieff in Hollywood. But I don't thoroughly understand it, honestly. Why would you do it? Doesn't make, I mean, unless you're a criminal yourself, then I can understand that criminals will do crime.